Welcome back to Knowledge is Kings, guys. I am Kings, and today's project was a request from the Laser Kings. As per usual, since it was their request, I will be sending them this project once it is finished, as long as they comment on the video telling me they would like it. I'll give them a week to comment. Anyway, if you clicked on the thumbnail, you know what we are about to make, and it's going to be a bread box. Let's get to it. So to start this, I need to figure out how tight a curve the tambours, the slats the doors are made from, can easily slide in. I also needed to figure out how wide to make the tambours. Here is my first test piece. For the tambours, I just screwed some OSB slats together, and these corners sort of worked, but they were a little tight. So for my second test piece, I made the corners less sharp. Now I did make a new set of tambours out of MDF, but they are fixed inside my final test piece, which you will see in a second. But I'll show you what it looks like with the cutoffs from the final tambours I made. I found that these corners allowed it to slide pretty well. What I didn't like were the big gaps it made in the steep corners. Not sure why, but this did slide really well only in one direction, but I knew it would slide better once lubricated a bit. For my final test piece, I made the top radius very large to keep the bend in the slats as small as possible. I pinned the assembly together to fully test everything. And I was happy with this, so I made a 3D model so I could get all my measurements. I start by making the tambours. I raided my cutoff bin and grabbed all the pieces that were big enough to make the tambours from. I ripped them on the table saw. After the first few pieces, I was having trouble keeping the small pieces tight against the table, so I stopped for a few minutes and quickly designed a new pusher that I had my CNC cut out for me. I didn't have a design to follow, so it ended up being sort of bulky, but it did help a lot in holding the pieces down better. Then I just continued cutting them all. I cut them all twice, once in one dimension, then rotating them 90 degrees and cutting the other dimension. Once that was done, I took them over to the router to round over the front two corners of each piece. So I had a piece that chipped out while rounding over the corners, and I make sure to put that one at the end where it will eventually be inside the case and never be seen. I set all the tambour pieces in the little L-shaped jig that I screwed to my bench, making sure to put the rounded corners down as I want the back facing up. I add a scrap piece so I don't get glue on my clamps in the next step. Then I add a couple of clamps to squeeze the tambours together. I'm using contact cement to glue the backing on. If the contact cement looks sort of thick and congealed, that's because it's not normal contact cement. This is contact cement gel. I didn't want the normally low viscosity contact cement to seep in between the tambours. Also, this doesn't smell as strongly as the normal stuff, and a day after setting it didn't smell at all. The thinner stuff seems to smell for a really long time after using it. I'm not sure if this glue is food safe or not, but it is a very small amount. It's able to fully dry with the fabric, and it never touches the bread that will end up being inside. So hopefully it'll be okay. I used this over food safe glue because I didn't have the time to let that glue dry. After about 15 minutes, I placed some yardsticks in between the cloth and the tambours because once the cloth hits the glue, it's stuck. You normally see people using dowels for this, but I can get a yardstick for less than $1, whereas the dowels are more than double that. While that was setting up a little more, I glued up a bunch of walnut for the sides and inside components using scrap walnut and walnut that doesn't have the best appearance for something I would actually make for a customer. I send all these pieces through the planer to smooth them out and get the proper thickness. Okay, so I'm going to use my CNC to make the side pieces because this project was being done in a hurry due to time constraints, and I wanted to get this done in one day. But I want to explain how you could make it without the CNC. So you need to cut a piece to use as a jig that has the same inside dimension of the groove you want to make. Then you need to temporarily affix that jig to your side piece, and using a pattern bit in your router, you can follow your jig. Cut a little, then lower the bit and cut again. Continue until you get the proper depth. The first lines that it is cutting are just reference lines, so I know where to place my internal pieces without having to spend a lot of time measuring to get them right. Now, I have seen a lot of people say you're not a real carpenter if you need to use a CNC machine to do your work, but I did make the 3D design, which takes some skill, and it does take additional skill to program the CNC to do what you want. Now, once you know how to use the CNC, it isn't that hard, but it does take a considerable amount of time to get it right. So using a CNC isn't necessarily due to a lack of skill, but for me it's a time thing. If I can get it done in about a minute, why wouldn't I? Plus, no matter how good I am, this is more accurate. One thing that I ended up doing that I didn't do on my test pieces was to bring the slot all the way through the end so that I could remove the tambour door in future if I ever needed to add more lubricant or if it breaks. This was a problem I realized after pinning together my final test piece, which is why tests are important. I deliberately didn't have the CNC cut all the way through, so I needed to cut it out on the bandsaw. Once I had it out, I took it over to the router table to trim off the excess. The notches in the front are round because of the round bit on the CNC, so I used a corner chisel to square them off. This is a very handy little tool to have. The reason the wood got wet after I used the chisel is because I had just sprayed some lubricant on the chisel as it was sticking for me. Then I give it a quick sanding to get rid of all the fuzzies. Time to cut all the internal pieces. In one dimension they are all the same, so I cut that dimension first. Then I cut each one to size. Back at the tambour door, I took the clamps off and tested to make sure everything bent easily without any of the pieces sticking. It all worked out great, so it's off to the table saw to cut it to its final width. Once I have it cut, I take it over to the router table to route the ends until they fit into the slots in the side pieces. I have not seen it done like this before. All the tambour doors I've seen make the tambours themselves the right thickness to fit into the slots. I do not like that, as then you can always see the gaps in the slots and the tambours. This way, the thickness of the tambours covers that gap. Now, that's not to say someone hasn't done it this way, I just haven't seen it. There's a common phrase that says, "There's nothing new in woodworking." Anyway, I make the passes at the router table, only taking a little at a time. I'm using a feather board to make sure the pieces are being held down tight at the bit without having my hand right over the bit. Before I add that to the case, I want to build a drawer which is made from cabinet grade pre-finished plywood. I rip the pieces on the table saw and then route a rabbet in the bottom of each piece, stopping short of the ends on 2 pieces. I nail the drawer together with a 23 gauge pin nailer. I did put screws into it later to make sure it stays together when it's pulled. Once it was together, I add the bottom piece, just pinning it in with the 23 gauge nailer. For the drawer glide, I pin a couple of plywood runners and follow the pins up with some screws. I'm going to be attaching the drawer to the tambour door, and to make the connection as solid as possible, I glued and screwed on an extra piece of wood. Then I test fit the tambours and drawer together. Once I thought it looked good, I pin it so it doesn't move on me when I screw it together. I added a bunch of paste wax to the grooves and the pins of the tambours to lubricate it. When I tested it, it worked so smoothly. But about a half hour later, the paste wax hardened and became sticky, so that was a big failure. I had to go in and scrape out as much as I could out of the groove and off the tambours. Yeah, you'll have that on these big jobs. Once everything was sanded, I put finish on all the parts that face inside or are completely inside the box. I'm using Odie's oil for this. I put tape anywhere I want to put glue later. I'm not sure how well the glue would hold up if there was finish on it. Once I have finish on everything, I glue the inside pieces together to make assembly easy. On this first piece, I drilled a couple of shallow holes where I added small dowels from the inside once the project was complete for drawer stops. I glue all the pieces on, and this is where the lines the CNC carved in for me come in handy in positioning everything easily. I pin everything together to hold it in place, but then I add clamps once it's all fully assembled. I put the door and drawer in to make sure with everything together it still works. It worked, but was very stiff since I didn't have any wood lubricant yet. When I closed the drawer, I could see that the tambour door was a little bit long, so I had to remove the drawer and I trimmed the door over at the joiner. Once I had that fixed, I milled a piece of walnut for the drawer front and pinned it on. Then I added a handle. Once I sanded the outside and applied finish, this project was done. Now my wife made a loaf of homemade bread for me to use in this project, so thanks to her for that. I still didn't have the wood lubricant that I ordered, so the whole pull is a little stiff. It's not bad, but when it's fully closed, it is enough resistance to pull the box forward. But once it's greased up a bit, it will be smooth as glass. That's all I had for this project. I hope you enjoyed it. Thanks again to the Laser Kings for suggesting this project. It was a fun one. Be sure to give this video a like as it really helps out the channel, and consider subscribing so you don't miss out on future videos. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Okay, so just before this posted, I got the wood lubricant that I had ordered, and I put it on there, and the door and drawer now slide very smoothly. Sorry about the video quality here. This was taken from my phone, transferred via email, so it doesn't look that great, and I didn't have my camera at the time I filmed. Also, I wanted to show you the little dowels that I put in the holes I showed earlier. These are what stop the drawer from coming out all the way. These are just pushed in there by hand, so I can take them out if I need to take the whole tambour door out. Okay, now I'm done.
Oh, I like that.